Well, good morning and Happy New Year to everybody. This is part of the Firestorm Crisis Coach 2018 webinar series underwritten by the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools, and we're delighted that you're with us live this morning or viewing this on demand in the afternoon one day. This does create an on-demand library of training that you can use and share within your school, and it's one of your benefits of being a member of the TAIS. So thank you again. We've probably been doing this series 4 to 5 years already. So a large database of information is there and available for you in your school. Last month, we talked about looking at 2017 and the crises that occurred and what are the lessons learned and the directions that we needed to take. Today, we're going to focus on helping your school make the most of 2018. And we're going to give you some ideas and maybe think about things in a little than you've thought in the past. So now if I can get my screen to advance, it looks like it did, and then just jump way ahead. So we'll go back. We want you social media platforms and opportunities for you to reach out and get information. There is a hashtag for today's session, and that's hashtag Crisis Coach. I would also remind you that we do a digital newsletter, Disaster Due Diligence, and it goes out every Thursday morning. If you're not receiving that free newsletter, you should sign up on our website. We'll be delighted to send it to you along with the thousands of others who get that each week. It's a great way to get information and get access to that you can use within your school. So there is a disclaimer today, and it says exercise, but it's a session, webinar, anything that it's got to have the oral comments associated with it. You've got to read this and listen to it in conjunction with what your legal counsel and authorities say in each area. And finally, today is not legal advice or legal opinion. I'm an engineer. I don't think I'm the guy you want telling you your legal status associated with any area. We transform crisis into value. That's what Firestorm does. We empower you to manage crisis and risk. Our expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We're America's crisis coach. That's one of our official brands and terms, and we like the concept of coach. We're here to help you be better in handling these types of events. Our goal is that you would never see those or have them occur, but I do think there's an opportunity here to make a real difference. We follow a predict, plan, perform methodology. I'm Jim Satterfield. I am the President and Chief Executive Officer of Firestorm, along with being one of the founders. Good news and exciting news about Firestorm that I wanted to share with everyone today is that our parent company, Novume, just was uplisted to the Nasdaq. Yesterday, our chairman of the board rang the bell at the closing of Nasdaq for the day, and that's an exciting thing to have happen in any organization. As you may remember from other webinars, Firestorm was acquired just about a year ago by Novume, and we're heading up the crisis and risk function there and see it as a great growth opportunity. And clearly now it gives us access to more resources to help you in every aspect of it. Truly, every crisis is a human crisis, and in thinking about that, we have just completed 2 new acquisitions that also give you more resources that you can take advantage of. On December the 31st, Firestorm acquired BC Management. In our space, they are the leaders in finding people and providing people to run the types of programs that you're doing in your school or in organizations, either on a permanent or a temporary staffing basis. And they're also in our industry the leaders in the benchmarking data that they collect in their 6 surveys annually. By the way, that's an opportunity for you to participate in those surveys, and then you get the full reports so that you would have tools to be able to go back to the leadership in your school and talk about this is where we are relative to standards and best practices. Additionally, on January the 1st, we acquired SEC, that's Secure Education Consultants. That's a team of Secret Service agents, retired Secret Service agents that are leaders in the area of physical security site assessments, active shooter training, certification in those areas, and the direct support that can be provided there. And so those tools are now available to you also. So it's been an exciting year of growth for us, and looks like 2018 will be the same. So we'll be sharing in the monthly webinars new partnerships and opportunities, but a lot to see and do that's occurred in a very short period of time. Our guests today, Rich Martin and Jill, are actually out on the road, which is no surprise. That happens to one of them almost all the time, but today we've got them both out making a difference to help schools in Tennessee and conferences and meetings. If you haven't been spending some time on their website, I would encourage you to do that. Great information and opportunities there. And there is a workshop series that's coming up next month across Tennessee. It'll be starting in Memphis and then go to Nashville and then Chattanooga around the sexual molestation issues that are happening in schools across the country, and what you should do now, what you need to do in those events and handle it. And we've all been watching all of the analysis of #MeToo and what that's meaning. And the removal of statute of limitations means that there are cases coming forward from individuals from 5, 10, as much as 40 years ago, and those are directly impacting our schools. So we want to help you in that direction, and that workshop series is, you can go on the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools websites and sign up and register for one of those 3 workshops as we move across the state in February. Now, I'm going to share with you today some insights because our goal here is, how do you improve your program in 2018? How do we really make a difference? And over the Christmas holidays, I saw the movie The Darkest Hour about Winston Churchill's first 3 to 4 weeks in office as Prime Minister of Great Britain at the start of World War II. And it's a very moving movie, and if you're into history at all or have any touch points back to that, maybe your parents might have served in World War II or at least been aware as they were growing up. It's an extremely moving film, but importantly for today's conversation, it focuses us on making decisions in a crisis, because clearly he was appointed at that point, and that's what he had to face. Now, I've enjoyed reading about Winston Churchill in the past in books and studying it in history, but I learned some things from the movie that either I failed to recognize or just had not occurred to me before. And looking at that, he was not the favored candidate to become Prime Minister. In fact, he was the compromised candidate, and he was selected, and they thought that he was inept, that he was a failure, that he could be easily manipulated, that he was an alcoholic, and that it was not someone that could be counted on, as they were trying to manipulate the system and use him as, my word, the patsy in that process. So I think they found out they made the wrong choice from that perspective, but they certainly made the right choice for Great Britain and the world at a time. Now, you think of Winston Churchill, and there was a quote about in the darkest hour, and that was done when they were being bombed by the Nazis in anticipation of an invasion of Great Britain. And the finest hour is a concept that he used in multiple speeches. In fact, I did a search and found 18 different uses of it at various times, and there's the quote that's up on the screen, which I'll read in just a moment, because I want to emphasize some points around it. But if you look at Winston Churchill, here is a person in those first 3 to 4 weeks. He was faced with having to make tough decisions and choosing between bad choices. Here's a bad choice, there's a bad choice. Which one do you want to do? And in a crisis, that's not at all uncommon. he inherited 300,000 British troops trapped in Dunkirk, surrounded by the Nazis and being killed. He also had 4,000 in Calais, another port just down the coast, in similar positions. And the military generals had come to Churchill and said, we will not be able to evacuate those 300,000 men. They'll be killed or captured, and we will be without an army and at the mercy of Hitler, who can easily invade us at that point in time. He refused to accept that assessment of the problem and directed the admiral to begin on a plan to evacuate those troops from Dunkirk. He came up with the idea of creating a private, using ships and boats 20 or 30 feet long, owned by private citizens trying to do that evacuation. And later the admiral was saying, well, we're not getting volunteers. And Churchill explained, this was not optional. We're taking the boats. We're getting the people out. Now, they were concerned in that the Nazi army had the air power and cover over the sea at this point. And so they needed a bad weather day, a cloudy day, where the flights and the travel would be limited at that point, that they could take advantage of it. So Winston Churchill sent a telegram to the general in Calais. By the way, it was the only way that they could communicate, and telling him that it was his job to take his 4,000 troops and to aggressively engage the enemy, to draw them away from Dunkirk to Calais, and to fight to the last man, that there would be no evacuation, no relief for them on the horizon. Imagine the pressure that it would be for Churchill or anyone to make a decision that's going to send 4,000 people to their death. And that was the type of person that he had. Clearly a bad choice, but clearly the only choice that he had available to him at that time. Now, history shows that they did that and were all lost, but they bought the time and the weather shifted and the private armada saved those 300,000 troops, and Britain survived. There was also great pressure on Churchill, and he was fighting not only the enemy in front, but the enemy behind, where they wanted him to negotiate a peace treaty with Hitler. And Mussolini was to act as an impartial intermediary in order to do that. By the way, that seems humorous in retrospect, but the pressure was great at that time, and the politicians were trying to trip Churchill into saying that he wouldn't negotiate with Hitler. And if he did, then they would have removed him from office. And so it was a fine line of how he could manage and do those things. And finally, it got to the point where he had no choice, but he was going to have to recommend that. But he, on his way to Parliament to talk that day, he went down into the tube, into the subway, and rode down to the next station and saw the average citizens, and they were startled to see their prime minister there. And he asked them what they would do if the Germans landed on the coast. Everyone said, we would fight and do what we have to do. And as he got that information, it supported him to be able to go back and refuse to negotiate, to lead the country in a different direction. And as a result, we know the outcome that came from that. But this was down to that particular point. Now let's go to the quote. To each there comes in their lifetime a special moment when they are figuratively tapped on the shoulder and offered the chance to do a very special thing, unique to them and fitted to their talents. What a tragedy if that moment finds them unprepared or unqualified for that which could have been their finest hour. You're on our webinar today, either live or on recording, and in your school, you've been the person tapped or appointed with looking at your plans and helping get us prepared in our school to handle these types of things. Are you prepared? Are you unprepared? Are your people qualified or not qualified? And how do you know that it would be their finest hour if these events occurred? Now, we've seen many things happen in the education marketplace over the years, and in particular, I'm reminded about fire. We haven't had a single child in America die in a school fire in over 50 years. That's a remarkable accomplishment. How did that happen? Well, we changed building codes. We put in smoke detectors. We put in sprinklers. We secured stairwells. We did training. We did drills on evacuation. It became a part of our culture within our schools to be prepared for that. And with confidence, we can say we haven't had a death in over 25 years. How confident are you around the subject of violence? We clearly can't say that we haven't had a student impacted by violence in 50 years, or 50 months, or 50 weeks, or 50 days, or even 50 hours. So when you look at that, there are threats and risks that are out there that we're unprepared for. And the only way that we can change and expect to have different results than what we've seen is if we attack the problem differently, that we get our plans in place, we get our people trained, that we're ready to deal with those things. So when that darkest hour comes, when it will become, in fact, our finest hour. So I'm going to encourage you today to think about your planning from a couple of different perspectives, and we're going to step you through what we're doing at Firestorm, and then I'm going to be asking you at each step along the way to think about your school and how are you doing the things that we're talking about. So first, we're going to talk about the first person you would contact, the value of the first person. We're going to talk about the first hour, because what's going to happen from an impact in that crisis will be determined in that first hour. And then finally, we're going to be talking about the finest hour and how do you know if that's where you are. So if we think about first person and we go back to that, we place a great deal of emphasis on that first person point of view. And if you're looking at the newscast, you're hearing someone talk about those events. And that's traditionally what we're looking to, is that first person perspective. If you think about your plans, I want to remind you that in a crisis, it's not business as usual. It's not school as usual. It's business as unusual. Most everything you know is going to be wrong or incomplete, but yet you're going to be forced to deal with it. In a crisis, what is it that you want that first person to decide, do, and say? You're going to hear us talk a lot today about decisions and words. That's how you can determine if your plan really is usable. And I want you to be able to break it down so it becomes very clear. Here's the decisions you're going to have to make. Here's the actions you're going to have to take. And here's the words that you're going to have to say. So this first person has got very specific responsibilities. Are those documented? Have you trained people on them? Has it been tested? I was speaking to a school group yesterday and going through, and they've did some good tracking within it, and they're seeing their episodes are increasing. And so what they wanted to figure out is, how is the best way for them to respond? How is there a way to start to change that trend and to have an impact? And that's the challenge I think that's before us all today. So in a crisis, who is the first person you look to? Now, the fact that you're on our webinar today may mean that your school is looking to you already to be that person. But who do you look to? Who do you look to alert? What are they supposed to do? How do they know what those things are? How does that come together? And who is their backup if they're unavailable? So as we start to review your plans, I want you to think about the first person in each area, for each threat, for each action, for each decision and each statement. Who is that first person? Now, we're going to break plans down into simpler components, into the decisions you make, the actions you take, and the words you say. We'll give you an insight into how do you know if your plans are actionable. And one of the things that we find, most of the plans that we review are not actionable. There maybe is a policy. In some cases, they might say what to do, but in almost every case, they don't tell you how to do it. If you can't take your plan, give it to the newest teacher in your school and have them understand what and how to do something in light of a particular description of an event, then your plan will fail. We want you to know that now, not at the time those things that are happening. So look at that first hour. We've got the first person. Let's concentrate on the first hour. In that first hour, what are the decisions that you need to make? What are the actions that you need to take? And finally, what are the words that you need to say? And we can map all of this back to the vulnerabilities and threats that you've identified within your school. So trying to take something that's complex and make it much more manageable and direct and easy to use. So we've talked about the first person. We've talked about the first hour. How do we know if it's our finest hour? Now, you may have seen this before. This is the Firestorm Crisis Maturity Model. It's how you measure did your group do in the actual crisis or in the exercise of or an event. You look at the decision process, the roles and responsibilities, the information clarity, the speed of decision making, and the communications effectiveness. Those are the 5 dimensions. And we measure them across 4 stages, going from a stage 1 liability, where everything is a surprise, to a stage 4, where it's part of your culture. It's strategic in nature. Every time you're able to move from one stage to the next, that's a breakthrough. Moving from just a stage 1 to a stage 2 is a control breakthrough. You now are in much more control of that crisis management and crisis event. If you move from a 2 to a 3, then it's now an alignment. You've got everything aligned the way that you need to. And then finally, if you can move to a stage 4 and it's strategic, there's a real value there. That's a differentiator for your school. Just as you excel in academics or in student growth on ethics and morals or athletics, you can have the same growth from a crisis perspective. Now, as you look and evaluate these, you are measured by your lowest scored dimension. If all of your dimensions came out at stage 4, except for example, speed of decision making, and it was a 1, then you're going to be overall evaluated as at that 1 level because you're held back by your weakest dimension. And so this is a way to start to build and track discipline so that we can make a difference. Like the story about the difference that planning for fires in schools have made, we can do exactly the same thing in each of these other areas in dealing with crisis. So if you take a deep breath, we've spent some time already starting to try to frame this and where we need to go. What can you do in 2018 to help your first person, your person that's going to be there? And so as we thought about it in Firestorm, we're going to share with you what we're doing, and then I want you to apply it to what you're doing in your program, in your school. And breaking this down to the first person in the first hour, you need to think about what do we need to do before, what do we need to do during, and what do we need to do after a crisis. So as you think through this today, and we point you in those directions, I want you to look at your plans, look at your program, and your program is not only the documents, it's the training, and it's the testing, and it's the actual rolling out in a real crisis that's going to make a difference. When we do this, we group all of these things together in terms of solutions, and I want you to think about the solutions within your school and look at it from one end to the other end. It's got to be an end-to-end solution. It's got to be seamless. For example, if you have plans but they've not been trained, then that's not going to be a solution. If you've got plans and they haven't been tested, then that's not going to be a solution. If in the actual crisis your leadership doesn't use the plans and processes that you put into place, then you're not going to have the outcome that you want to have. So we look at this in 6 different verticals. And I'm going to share the 6 verticals that Firestorm is structured in for you to think about how are you structuring your school along these 6 different vertical areas. And we'll go through each of those quickly here, and then we'll spend a minute or 2 in each one of those verticals. What are your crisis and risk solutions? How are you structured to deal with a crisis? How do you evaluate the risks that are out there? What risk are you accepting? What risk are you trying to transfer with insurance? How do each of those things come into play? Look at your program today, and you hear me continually using the term program as opposed to plan, because all of these elements have to become integrated. So the first thing, give yourself a report card on crisis and risk. We'll give you some more insights on that in just a moment. Second, the people solutions. Do you have the right people assigned? Do they have the training that they need? Do they have this, the level of expertise, and are they growing in their jobs? So having the people solutions makes a difference within it. Crisis and risk, people. Third is the security area. Now, in many cases, you may be thinking about emergency or thinking about other aspects, but not thinking so much about security. Maybe that's someone else's responsibility within your school. But how do we integrate that overall into what we're doing? Because in today's world, security must be an integral part of each of the elements. Professional services, the services that you're providing internally. You're the professional within your school around the training, developing of plans, the testing of it, making sure that everybody understands the how-to in addition to the what associated with it. The third is intelligence solutions, the ability to predict, to identify that student that's at risk, that might be on a path to violence, and that you can intervene in beforehand. And then finally, the analytical solutions. How do we know how we are in our program? How do we compare to what other schools have? What are the metrics? What are the data that we're using to make those evaluations? So if you evaluate your program along each of these 6 verticals, I think it will give you an opportunity to have a much better understanding of what you can do to optimize those solutions for your school in 2018. I'm going to go through each one of these 6 quickly, just so you've got a background. So if we think about crisis and risk solutions, we follow a predict, plan, perform methodology. I would encourage you to do the same thing. What are the vulnerabilities and threats that you're likely to face? How do you monitor those? Who monitors them? What are the triggers that would cause activation of your individual plans? What are the impacts associated with them? What are the decisions you'll have to make? What are the actions you'll have to take? What are the words you're going to have to say? All of that falls under predict. The plans, the actual documents, and the perform leads to the training and testing, and then the actual crisis management. Within Firestorm, this is what we do. Now, you should make sure that your program covers that emergency response, incident management, and crisis management. We have a program that's called Crisis Index, and it's a way for you to start to think about how do you compare this crisis to that crisis, and that's by looking out, is there outrage, is there fault, and is there fear? Once you begin to understand that, it'll be a way to help drive your decision process throughout it. Now, we've set up a 24/7 real-time crisis operations center to field the calls that we're receiving from all of our clients and schools and businesses. But within your school, what's going to happen? Who gets that call 24/7? How do we get that response? Because even at night and weekends, there will be matters that will have an impact on the school. Firestorm uses the term crisis coach. You're welcome to talk about how you can coach the people in your program to become better, and then having training and then exercises. We do not know that a plan will work until we test it. Now, as a part of your membership with the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools, you receive Crisis Stop. Crisis Stop is a no-fee program for your school. It won't cost you any money for that first hour of crisis support. If you're in a crisis or even think you're in a crisis, pick up the phone and call us. We'll help you stabilize the event. We'll help trigger the resources that you need. We'll opine on the consequences. And then finally, we'll help you prevent making the common crisis mistakes. So that first hour that's very important. We'll be standing with you shoulder to shoulder, and it won't cost your school any money. So call us. The sooner we get there, the sooner we can begin to help you, the less the impact is going to be. So let's go into people solutions. You got to have the right people. Sometimes it's a permanent staff. Sometimes it's temporary. It could be interim, or it could even be virtual staffing. And we have a program to augment your staff virtually, so you don't have to go to the expense to have those people on site in the program. We've been expert counsel with 130 nationally recognized experts to be able to address those variety of exposures that are there and what the responses would be. Coaching, both what we can do and what you can do to coaching your people up. In some cases, you might need an external consultant to develop a plan to come in. And in some cases, it's either a permanent student who should be staffing this interim with us, and what is that expertise that we can use. And maybe you only need it for a short period of time to pull some things in place. We do virtual staffing. We can supply you a virtual chief security officer or a chief information security officer, or in any other component to have that available to augment what you're doing, because we know you've got a full-time job in each area. But the next 4 words are the most important to you. I would ask you, what are you doing to help your people grow? How are they getting better at what you need them to do as part of your program in your school? Mentoring that you can do, mentoring with other schools that are part of TAIS, growing on individual bases to get to where you need to accomplish. So we thought about first in looking at the crisis and risk. Now we're thinking about you need to look at the people solutions within your school. Security solutions, and this is a major change that we've seen over the last several years as violence has continued to escalate, both from internal and external threats. And so looking at consulting, training, and education there, we can supply you a virtual chief security officer. Our chief security officer, Jason Russell, his mission is to provide presidential level protection for those in your charge. You have care, custody, and control. Having access to our retired Secret Service officers that can do those areas, and consulting about here are some security changes that you can make. Here's the training. We have an active shooter violence assessment that helps you understand where you are relative to best practices and standards in this area. The physical security assessments in working in it could even be cyber. Our schools are being targeted from a cyber breach standpoint. We do have certification that we do around active shooter, and Jason's team can do that with the training and annually update it. Bertha is our behavioral risk threat assessment program, empowering you to identify behaviors of concern before they escalate to violence and intervene. We are increasingly being called in to participate in construction programs and in the design of additions to campuses or new buildings. What can we do to minimize the exposure that's associated with that and coming into place? So I would like you to go back and look at your program, look at what you're doing from a security perspective. One of the things that we've seen in many schools is security is handled in one place and the emergency is handled and the crisis management is handled differently. We've got to bring those and integrate them into your program. You're the provider of professional services for your school. You're assessing what the areas are, you're addressing them, and then finally you're acting associated with them. So it's about getting that first person that we talked about earlier, the critical decision support that they need in order to make those decisions. If you need assistance in developing a custom plan, or if you just need tools or templates, reach out to us. We can empower you with those areas. Looking at the crisis response, the training, the exercises, for every vulnerability and threat that you have, I would encourage you to start to think about what your message maps are. What are your communications that you need to be put into place? And as I shared earlier, there are assessments that we can perform for you at no cost that would then be useful in getting your board support and the support of senior leadership within your school. So intelligent solutions, and maybe this is a new area for you. Maybe you haven't thought about this in the program in your school. It's both predictive and protective, and in many situations we're able to prevent, so it's preventative. Looking at a risk profile, what are the risks that you're concerned about? How do we map those threats and get the right person involved as early as possible to minimize or mitigate or even prevent that from occurring? How that gets escalated. And back in this area, there's some statistics that work to our advantages. 80% of the time, if someone has ill intent, someone else knows, and 67% of the time, 2 or more people know. And when they know, what do? They talk. And so monitoring social media, having an anonymous reporting system all comes into play. So we have to be concerned about each of those things and looking and putting them in place. Every time that there is an event, we would encourage you to do an after-action review or a hot wash. What are the findings? What are the lessons learned? How would you improve those, your planning and programs? That will make a difference in future outcomes. And lastly, the analytical, the benchmarking, the program comparisons, industry and data insights. Having the assessment done, participating in a national benchmarking around some of the components so that you get the reports out that are available to do that. Looking at what you're paying for these areas. We see compensation, what should I be paying? How does that work? How do I measure up to my peers? We can even work with TAIS and do an analysis just across Tennessee, so you've got that ability to compare to what other schools have done. What are the diagnostics? What are the metrics that you're using in looking at your program? And that's a differentiator. You do not want to be known as the school where this occurred, whatever it is. Now, I'm in Georgia, and the state flower, by the way, in Georgia is the Cherokee Rose. I'm not sure of the state flower in Tennessee. Colorado, the state flower is Columbine. That's not what you think of when you hear the name Columbine. You don't think of it as a state flower. You think of it as the horrific events that occurred there. Do you want your school to be remembered by what your mission is and what you're calling, or what happened to it in those types of impacts? So analytical solutions make a big difference in understanding each of those various things through the process and where you are relative to those areas. So if we're trying to give you a program to be able to do that and a methodology, my first goal for you is to think about who is the first person? What do we want to decide in the first hour? What do we want to do? What do we want to say? Those words make a difference in that first hour. And how will we get to having this be our finest hour? In looking at that, we follow a predict, plan, perform methodology. Understanding that might be a good way for you to look at your program and looking at what you're doing to predict, looking at what you're doing to plan, and then looking to how can you perform better. Now, I wanted to give you some insights just to focus on the communications area, because this makes a major difference in a crisis. And every time when you look and you see, they're going to regret saying that in a crisis because they said the wrong thing at the wrong time, and it actually made a bad situation even worse. There are 3 types of communications in any crisis. The first is coordination communications. It's going to always be the first, and it's always the most important. What is it that you want people to do? Do you want them to shelter in place? Do you want them to evacuate? Do you want to have a lockout, a lockdown? Who's going to deliver the message? How is the message going to get out? And is it clear and understood? So you're always going to make that your first crisis communications. The second is the crisis itself. That's addressing the brand and reputational impacts. By the way, this is the one you're going to be under the most pressure to communicate early on. Someone on your board is going to say, well, we need to frame this issue. We need to get out in front of it. In every crisis, this will be the last communication that you make. We're going to wait at least the first 24 hours in the crisis to deal with the coordination, to deal with handling the matter before we comment on it from a brand and reputation standpoint. So it's important. It needs to be done, but it doesn't need to be done first. Additionally, we recommend that the initial communications coming from the school is not from the head of school, because if the head of school misspeaks because of inadequate or inaccurate information, the loss of credibility will exacerbate this crisis and make it much worse. And finally, compliance. You're a mandated reporter. If you have knowledge or have an expectation that a child is at risk, whether it's domestic violence in the home or something at school, you then have to report that to the police or to the family services. You're a mandated reporter. You have legal responsibilities in these areas. Additionally, you have other compliance responsibilities. For example, in a cyber breach, if someone's identity has been stolen, having to communicate that information in a reasonable period of time. So understanding what your responsibilities are from a coordination, crisis, and a compliance area, and what you're going to communicate will make a difference in how this crisis comes back. Is there outrage? Is there fault? And is there fear? Beyond communications, the predict, plan, perform that we talked about is the simplest way for you to look at your current plan, predict what the vulnerabilities and threats are, what are their impacts, how do you monitor them, what are the triggers that would activate your plans, what are the decisions that you need to make, what are the actions you need to take, what are the words that you need to say. All of that will come started based upon that predict focus. The plans are the documents themselves, and it goes beyond that into the perform with the training, the testing, the exercises. Look at your plans. Look at it from a predict perspective, look at it from a planning perspective, and finally under a performance perspective. That's going to be the best way for us to understand where we are at that most critical time so that it can in fact become our finest hour. My prayer for you is that your school never finds itself in this place. Unfortunately, every day we find the threats and risks there. We find these situations occurring and we see their impacts. No one wants to be in a position of having to pick up that phone to call a family and say, your child's not coming home from school today. Those are the reasons why we look at each of these areas. We want them to find you prepared, not unprepared. We want them to find you qualified, not unqualified, because we want it to be truly your finest hour in your schools, because in a crisis, it's a defining event. So what's next? You can download this session and others off the Firestorm website at no cost. I would encourage you to do that. You can share the webinar with others in your school. We can have an assessment done of your plan at no cost to you. It takes about 45 minutes, and we would do that in a virtual setting to go through, and then you'd have a findings report to go back and say, here's where we need to go. And that crisis stop program. If you find yourself in a crisis, pick up the phone and call us 24/7. We'll help you stabilize the events, trigger the resources, opine on the consequences, and finally then to help you prevent making the common crisis mistakes. That first hour is at no cost. We've got the workshops that we'll be doing in Memphis, Nashville, and Chattanooga around the issues of sexual molestation and those matters in our schools, what you need to be doing before, during, and after in those areas. And if you think about the hashtag #MeToo and everything you're seeing, it says that this is a growing concern because the statute of limitations has been removed. So we'd like to say thank you to the association, the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools, for their ongoing support of this program and this webinar series. If you've got questions, you can go to firestorm.com, or you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can call us at 800-321-2219. That phone is manned 24/7 at our Crisis Control Center, and we're available to help you. And that first hour is done at no cost. Let us know what else you need. We look forward to next month and meeting you again. Thank you for all you're doing in your school to help our young people grow morally, ethically, academically, physically. This is an important time in our country. It's an important time in our school. Thank you again for all you do. So until we speak again, have a great day. Goodbye.